Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. It's a brand new year, a great time for fresh starts, and in the interest of new beginnings, I thought it would be a good idea to revisit the first ever commander that we tackled in the Upping the Average series. This is a Muldrotha the Gravetide Upping the Average Redux. We all know and love, or hate, Muldrotha. Sultai 6-mana 6/6 that gets back one permanent of each type from our graveyard per turn, effectively turning our graveyard into our second hand. For a while there, Muldrotha was the #1 most popular commander of the past 2 years, but she's since slipped back down to rank 6, still a perfectly respectable and powerful place to be. Though she's seen a bevy of new toys over the years, she's still got an absolutely stacked EDHREC page. Let's check out where her average deck is nowadays to see how we can improve Muldrotha in modern times. Remember that in this series, all swaps must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall price of the deck. To me, Muldrotha is the quintessential, I wish I could play 150 cards in this deck commander. These cards are so dang good, and when I first looked over this list, I was thinking of so many other cards that I wanted to add in to synergize with these cards. The pile of cards that don't make the cut in the 99 of a Muldrotha deck is seriously so big that you could use it to make another Muldrotha deck. This commander is one of the reasons I don't think people should use the phrase auto-include when talking about EDH decks. I don't know, whenever someone says, oh yeah, that's an auto-include from Muldrotha for sure, I'm like, yeah, but so are 200 other cards. We can only play 100 cards here, Steve. Anyway, let's try to familiarize ourselves with some of Muldrotha's core cards. First are the self-sacrificing cards, playable each and every turn if you need them to be. More Sakura Tribe Elders means we have Endless Ramp, and Muldrifter can always evoke itself for repeated draw, and cards like Seal of Primordium always keep problem enchantments and artifacts out of sight. The card advantage in this deck is also kind of out of this world. Mystic Remora can avoid an increasing cumulative upkeep cost and thus draw bunches of cards, and Secrets of the Dead and River Kelpie draw a ton of cards when we cast things back from the yard. Then of course we have the graveyard fillers. Gravebreaker Lamia is both an enchantment and a creature, so we can play it as either type Muldrotha needs for her quotas, and it not only fills the yard, but it makes it easier to cast things back out of it too. Underrealm Lich turns our regular advantage into super selection, and Ashnods can sacrifice our creatures while providing mana to cast them all over again. Meanwhile, Ashiok helps mill ourselves to find more juicy cards while keeping other graveyard players in check, and Altar of Dementia has become a mainstay for many Muldrotha decks too, always making sure that creatures get sacrificed in response to any potential exile effects, while continuing to dig. And I also have to say that I kinda love Lord of the Forsaken in this deck too. Like, that effect here is just funny as heck. To get around the 1 creature per turn restriction, Muldrotha decks also love Animate Dead as an enchantment for the turn to bring back other creatures along for the ride. But some of the best synergies in this deck are honestly Kaya's Ghost Form and Spore Frog. Repeatable Fog Frog is bonkers difficult to deal with for a whole bunch of decks out there, and Kaya's Ghost Form ensures that Muldrotha stays protected from removal turn after turn. Speaking of removal though, I think that's something we have to take special note of in this deck. A lot of Muldrotha's most popular cards are removal. Plaguecrafter, Caustic Caterpillar, Chupacabra, these are good effects even one time, but here they can happen over and over and over again, and again, and again. Nev's Disc and Pernicious Deed can wipe the board so many times. And just in case this draws attention from the opposition, well, Glenalendra and Siren Stormtamer help keep Muldrotha untouchable over and over. In fact, if you really need to, a thing like Eternal Witness can bring back a card like Cyclonic Rift over and over again too, and that's pretty darn devastating. And honestly, it makes sense why this is the case. When you can double and triple up every card you play, you'll always have more advantage than your opponents, so negating their cards means you'll stay ahead of them forever. However, this is a dynamic that I think requires a good degree of care. I don't want us to just have a deck that is in charge of preventing other players from playing, but I also want us to craft a deck that is in charge of its own forward momentum too. And thus, it's time for us to get to the official swaps. I'm going to have 2 sections for this video. First, tackling the list in its current state, updating and upgrading. And second, I'd like to provide a second pass at the list that views it through the lens of a more budget brew. That's right, this video will have 2 deck lists for Muldrotha in the description below. So let's get started with part 1. So since this is a Redux, I'm likely to cover some of the same ground as the previous Muldrotha video. However, I can't even necessarily say that I think the previous video is a very worthwhile watch these days. The series' identity was pretty clearly in its developing stages. And besides that, there have also just been a lot of changes in EDH since that time several years ago. So we will cover some of the same ground, but there will be definite differences. For this video, my main mission is basically twofold. I first want to examine our type distribution, and then, more importantly, our mana curve. First, type distribution. We have 31 creatures, but only 10 artifacts and 10 enchantments. Muldrotha's recursion effect is very powerful, but we can only cast 1 creature from the yard per turn. So these are some numbers that I'm interested in redistributing a bit, so that we can glean more value from Muldrotha by creating more circumstances in which we can cast multiple card types per turn as often as possible. However, the biggest issue isn't even with those card types, it's also with our non-permanent spells. Instants and sorceries are not Muldrotha recurable, and thus we have to be pretty critical of them. They're not all worth cutting, not by any means, but if an effect can be achieved on a permanent instead of an instant or sorcery, we should take notice of that. Specifically, Cultivate catches my eye here. I'd like very much to trade this for a bauble. Still ramp, but one that we can continually cast over and over again. What can I say? I like ramp that also synergizes late game with cards like Secrets of the Dead. Then there's Counterspell and Factor Fiction. We have Counterspell effects on permanents in the deck already, and even if we didn't, I don't think that this is the best Counterspell effect we could be running anyway. And Factor Fiction does fill the yard while providing selection, but this isn't a unique enough effect in my eyes, at least. I'll mention some other related replacements later on, but for now, I feel like we pretty desperately need a second pair of shoes here. We have the Greaves in this deck already, but no Swiftfoot boots. Muldrotha is treated as kill on sight by almost every opponent we'll face. She needs more protection, and protection on permanents is very solid. The other instants and sorceries present in this list I think will come down to a matter of personal comfort. Many Muldrotha players would argue that basically all the non-permanent cards should go, and others will argue that they're fine to keep because you need cards that you can use even when Muldrotha is not in play. I personally appreciate some of this instant speed interaction here, and effects like Rift or Entomb, or indeed even Villainous Wealth, are pretty unique in the way that they function here. I mean, Villainous Wealth is just stinking fun to play, especially when recurred over and over again with an Eternal Witness, you know? At a certain point, tune-ups and technicalities don't hold a candle to this kind of hilarious potential. So suffice it to say, these instants and sorceries, especially these expensive instants and sorceries, are actually things that I'll end up tackling in greater detail in the budget section later on. For now, the thing that really worries me is our land count. I just don't think 34 lands is anywhere near the appropriate amount for a commander that costs 6 mana. Just no. So I'm making 2 quick cuts here. First, Ramanop is redundant with our commander. It's backup if she's not around, but it's very do-nothing when she is around, so I'm just not enamored by it. And Sultai Ascendancy I have, sadly, no love for. We already have near 15 other cards in the list that help put things into the yard. I just don't think this is an effect we need more help with. With that room made, I'm adding in 2 very spicy lands for Muldrotha, High Market and Ghost Quarter. High Market helps us sacrifice any creatures we want to recast to get their effects again, not to mention helps them avoid exile effects. And Ghost Quarter feels really nice to play multiple times to constantly befuddle our opponent's Cabal Coffers and Nykthoses. Or heck, we can use it on our own lands to get stuff like landfall triggers and other lands in the graveyard. We have lands matter cards like Gitrog and Tatiova in this list after all. This is a very multiplicitous land in this deck. That brings us to 36 lands, which makes me heave a huge sigh of relief, but the mana situation isn't over yet. This may be a divisive cut, but I personally want to exchange Birds of Paradise for a Sanctum Weaver. Birds is a cool card, but given where this list is at, I'm not sure if it's a $12 worth of cool card. Sanctum Weaver is a cheap creature that also taps for mana, but can also tap for a lot more than just the 1 mana, because we consistently wind up with a few enchantments in play. Plus, since it's an enchantment itself, Muldrotha can cast this from the graveyard as the enchantment per turn, rather than taking up her creature slot. I just think that all these factors warrant the pursuit of a Sanctum Weaver to get more bang for your buck. Alright, now we're on to the hardest part. Looking through the artifacts and enchantments, we really don't have many from the original average list that can sacrifice themselves. There's the occasional Seal and Commander Sphere, but these sections both feel to me like areas that vastly need improving. What artifacts and enchantments is this deck constantly recasting? In addition to this, our mana curve is kinda wacky. We want to cast multiple cards from the yard per turn, but when our cards cost 5 mana, it's hard to actually cast multiple of them a turn. Thus, I'm going to make 3 tough cuts here: Acidic Slime, Eldest Reborn, and Binding of the Old Gods. These pain me to cut, and the swap-ins I'm about to suggest may look bizarre when we get to them, but the mana costs on these cards just always felt to me like they got in the way. I want us to be wise about where our high mana costs go. On huge card advantage engines like Gitrog, a high mana cost is totally justified. On pinpoint removal, though, 5 mana is a tougher sell, and although I love these sagas especially, we have to admit that they take time to do their jobs and get back into the graveyard. Time that we can't always afford if so much of our deck is operating at sorcery speed, and we have to wait 2 more turns to get back the effect that we want on the saga's Chapter 1. Anyway, I'll stop over-explaining and just introduce you to the cards that I want to add in exchange. 1 mana Nuisances, Seal of Removal, and some Spell Bombs. Like I mentioned before, we have very, very few artifacts and enchantments that can sacrifice themselves from the original average list. I think we need more of those, especially if they offer us instant speed interaction. Grave Hate is extremely valuable on the Nile Spellbomb because we won't be the only player making intense use of our graveyard. Bouncing Creatures doesn't look like much, but it kinda guarantees our most threatening opponent never gets to equip their boots to their commander, or in fact ever gets to keep their commander in play in the first place because we'll just keep getting rid of it for 1 mana forever. Nasty tokens will disappear forever when we bounce them, and any big attacker is really easily dealt with. Heck, these can bounce our own stuff to hand to protect our commander from removal, for example, so that we can replay it more cheaply too. Or we can just cash in the spell bombs for incidental card draw, which is actually kinda huge. I'd rather get in these little bits of possible draw here and there compared to the original average list where it was rare to cast artifacts from the graveyard nearly at all. Heck, some of these cards are free to cast when we have something like a Lamia in play. And Secrets of the Dead is delighted by the prospect of more and more cheap cards to cast out of the yard every single turn. Instant speed interaction for a low mana cost that can even save our own stuff and that never ever truly goes away. Little nuisances like this make Muldrotha an evil cockroach that can never be killed. I'm not done on the removal at instant speed though. I don't like Shriekmaw very much. Sorcery speed only hits non-black, non-artifact. I'm just kinda off it. I prefer Sinister Concoction these days. The costs are negligible, and the interaction is cheap and swift. Heck, the mill and discard outlet might even be things that we want in this deck. I am delighted to add this one in. But it turns out I'm really not done consternating our opponents. See, I added 2 lands in earlier, but I have one more evil suggestion to put in here too. Glacial Chasm. We can't be attacked. With an inconsequential cumulative upkeep that we can just reset whenever we need to, Chasm provides tons of time for Muldrotha to find her key cards and set up a victory swing, or to hide back behind it whenever necessary. If your opponents thought that Spore Frog was annoying, yeah, they haven't seen anything yet. Oh, and one final quality of life improvement for the removal suite. If we're playing 2 sacrificey creatures, the Plaguecrafter and this one here, the Fleshbag, I'd rather play Demon's Disciple instead of the zombie, just in case we encounter any Super Friends players out there. Alright, we're almost out of the woods, but I have 2 more cards to add, which means 2 more cards to cut. Specifically, I want to hone in on our win conditions. Like I said, I want us to be in charge of our own forward momentum to close out the games efficiently. Muldrotha decks can spin their wheels, removing everything in sight, but value isn't victory. We need ways to actually close out a game. I'm gonna end up removing Sidisi from the creature suite, and this here Renin 7 as well. I like the ideas on these, but I think Sidisi is only half good at both of her jobs here. Filling the yard is fine, but not something we really struggle with, and the zombie making isn't as consistent a token maker as we could be using. As for Ren, there's again a really good graveyard filling effect here, and the tokens it makes can be decently big, but I don't know, the other abilities just don't thrill me, especially not on a card that is this monetarily expensive. I think we need faster and more reliable methods of actually closing down a game once we've gotten control, and thus, my recommendations from the first Muldrotha video are coming back in full swing here. I like Mazarek and Conrad so much for this deck. These are engines that are definitely worth their mana cost. Have you seen how much stuff we sacrifice in this deck? Lands, enchantments, artifacts, creatures, all those 1/1s and 2/2s in our deck will become 10/10s in such a short amount of time, and that makes it a cinch to close out the game. As for Conrad, I don't even know if I need to explain this one. He fills the yard, he's a mana sink, he rewards us when we sacrifice our creatures and when we pull them out of the graveyard each turn. He's Muldrotha's Dark Prince, and he's just an uncommon. Play him. He's beautiful. That does it for my official swaps, but before I move on to section 2 and talk about budget, I want to discuss honorable mentions, specifically for players who will splurge on their Muldrotha decks even further. The most obvious thing to upgrade in this deck will be its mana accelerants. Talismans and even some signets are over like $5, which is weird, but those small improvements could be worthwhile. The original deck also contains an Animate Dead, and if you want to do even more reanimation in your Muldrotha deck, Necromancy is a personal favorite of mine. And if you need even more protection to keep your commander alive, then Sylvan Safekeeper is definitely your go-to pal. I personally love Cephalid Colosseum and Phyrexian Tower in this deck too, since they can either dig for more cards or sacrifice a creature while adding more mana to replay that creature. Some higher end players may decide, instead of the win cons I suggested, to go with a Kokosho or a combination of Gerard and Lord of Extinction instead, constantly recurring them to obliterate enemy life totals. But my personal favorite upgrade for this deck has to be Teferi. I mean, Muldrotha can recur Planeswalkers too. The looting effect fills the yard while sculpting the hand, and the phasing effect is terrific instant speed protection. And if we get extra turns, it's just devastating. Muldrotha loves every bit of help that we get from our Dominarian hero. Alright, that does it for this extended first section. Here we have a more modern Muldrotha, and you can find the list in the description below. But remember, we're not done yet. We've got a budget build to brew. It's almost impossible to build a bad Muldrotha deck. No matter what you recur with her, she's a powerhouse. In fact, some players actually will give themselves a theme to build around when playing Muldrotha, just to slim down the overwhelming number of possible cards that she could play. I bring this up to point out that even if we don't have access to the entirety of Muldrotha's potential card pool, a budget Muldrotha deck is still gonna be a herkin' awesome Muldrotha deck. So let's slice this deck's price by more than 2/3. I'm going to cut anything above the $10 mark. So first, the lands. The average mana base in the original average deck list contained fetches and shocks. That's not where every player is at, and that's no problem. For color fixing, stuff like pain lands or basics are perfectly fine. Muldrotha loves pulling fetch lands out of the yard every turn, it's true, but there are budget fetches already in this deck, and they're fine for that purpose. As for shocks, we're okay with other dual typed lands in their place, that's fine too. We don't need to break the bank on the mana base. In fact, the Triome for this deck is over $10 as well, and if that's not where you're at, I'd like to suggest maybe taking a look at Cryptic Caves for a utility land in this slot instead. Could be some nice incidental card draw, you know? Next, the Dryad. He's very saucy, I know, but he's like $15. Wood Elves is a perfectly fine replacement. In fact, while we're talking about lands, Life from the Loam is a mana-ish related card that helps us fill the graveyard. And if you want to save the money, I think a Skull Prophet is perfectly fine. Mana or mill is nice flexibility for whatever we need, whenever we need it. The next thing we have to tackle are, of course, the tutors. Mono Black Sidisi, Demonic Tutor, and Entomb are powerhouse cards, there is no doubt. But we can still tutor on a budget. Vile Entomber is one of my personal favorite cards from last year. That Death Touch is really cool. And Unmarked Grave is a much cheaper card than Entomb, and it still gets a lot of the same targets. And Auric Loremage is just cool. Tutor every turn for exactly the thing that Muldrotha needs? Spicy. Two of the most expensive enchantments in this list are also big card advantage engines, Rhystic and Remora. And it's a real wrench not having those, but we still have plenty of cool things to try out in their absence. Vessel of Nascency is small, but repeatable filtering is a pretty big deal. Don't underestimate it. And okay, this next suggestion is, I will admit, a little off the wall, but have y'all tried Rod of Absorption in this deck? It's kind of amazing. People cast cool spells, and then we can do it too. And then we can recast the Rod to do it again later. I don't know, this one is just really enchanting to me, even if it is an artifact. I think it's worth trying out, just to scare your opponents a little, since they really won't expect all the shenanigans that this thing can let you pull off. Alright, these swaps are getting a lot less one-for-one as time goes on, but let's briefly tackle the removal situation. Assassin's Trophy is pricey, and Rift is, Rift. As simple as it is, I think that Seal of Doom is a fine replacement for the trophy. It's still an instant speed effect, and that's important. The non-black rider is tough, I admit, but interaction matters a lot on pinpoint effects sometimes. As for Rift, nothing can truly replace it, but I'm personally a pretty big fan of using Phyrexian Scriptures in Muldrotha decks. I just think it's gas. A board wipe you can cast over and over again, and one that can make yourself one-sided, it's pretty stellar. Finally, these two sacrifice outlets are high-priced cards too, so let's take those out, but rather than going for direct swaps on those cards, let's ask what we still need. In my opinion, we need some more tricks, and nothing's more tricky than Liquimetal Torque, which I think might actually be my favorite card from last year. We have so many effects that destroy artifacts and enchantments, and this is a mana rock that will help us more reliably cast our commander, and which can also turn anything our opponents play into a very susceptible target. This is hysterical synergy. And lastly, I also think we need one other fun win condition too, and there's nothing I like better for this deck than a funky old Tormod. Whenever a card leaves our graveyard, we make a zombie. Well, he's in luck, because we will indeed have a lot of cards leaving our graveyard one at a time in this deck. I think this too will surprise enemies with just how out of hand it gets in such a short amount of time. Alright, there we go! A significantly cheaper Muldrotha deck that still packs a wallop. You can find this list in the description below with all the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed mulling things over with Muldrotha, and if you have any other recommendations you'd like to make for your fellow Gravetide surfers, make sure you leave them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.